Once upon a time, there was a couple named Femi and Ada. After they got married, it took them several years of prayer and patience before they were finally blessed with their only daughter, Amara. The couple cherished her deeply, and they were always grateful to God for blessing them with Amara when all hope seemed lost. One quiet evening, after they had packed their bags for an impromptu journey, Femi and Ada prepared to leave for the trip. Amara, who was playing with her toys in the living room, had no idea that her parents were about to leave her behind. The couple, in their haste to catch an early bus, forgot to arrange for someone to take care of their daughter. "Are you sure we've packed everything we need?" Ada asked her husband, glancing around the house one last time. "Yes, we're all set. I just don't want to miss this opportunity," Femi replied confidently. They rushed out of the house, locked the door, and left for their journey, completely forgetting about Amara. As they traveled, the couple engaged in light conversation, unaware of the mistake they had made. Meanwhile, back at home, Amara continued playing, blissfully unaware that her parents were already far away. Night began to fall and she grew tired. She looked around for her mother and father but couldn't find them anywhere in the house. Confused, she wandered into the kitchen, hoping to see them, but the house was empty. Hours passed, and the house grew quiet and dark. Amara felt scared and lonely. Eventually, she heard a faint growling sound from outside. It was their neighbor's dog. The neighbor, Mr. Obinna, had always been envious of Femi and Ada because they had Amara, while he and his wife, Nkechi, had no children. Their dog, known for its aggressive behavior, had been the source of many complaints. As Amara stepped out to see where the sound was coming from, she noticed the gate to the compound slightly ajar. Before she could react, the dog lunged at her, biting her on the leg. Amara screamed in pain, but no one came to help her. The once peaceful evening had turned into a nightmare. Mr. Obinna rushed out of his house when he heard the commotion, but instead of showing concern, he stood at a distance, his face filled with indifference. Ada watched the landscape blur past the car window as they drove toward the bus terminal. The silence between her and Femi was thick, tense. It had been like this for months. The vacation they were headed to wasn't just about taking time off. It was about reconnecting. At least that's what she hoped. "Are you excited about the trip?" Femi asked, trying to sound enthusiastic, though his voice lacked energy. "I am," Ada replied quietly. "We need this." Femi nodded but didn't respond. He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as if the tension between them had spread to his hands. He loved Ada. There was no doubt about that. But lately, he felt like everything he did was never enough. Work had consumed so much of his time, and now he was losing the little family time he had left. But what could he do? Amara was their only child, and the fear of not having another weighed on him more than he wanted to admit. Ada looked at him, her suspicion flaring again. It was the same thought that had been haunting her for months. Was he working late because of his job? Or was there someone else? It wasn't just about work, though. He had become distant, more focused on things that didn't involve her. And she couldn't shake the feeling that he was avoiding her because Amara was a girl. She hated that thought, but it kept creeping back into her mind. "I'm glad we're finally doing this," Ada said after a long pause. "It's been hard lately." "Yeah, I know," Femi muttered, his eyes fixed on the road. He wanted to say more, to tell her that his distance wasn't because he didn't care. But he couldn't. Every time he tried to explain, the words felt inadequate. "You don't talk to me anymore, Femi." Ada's voice was softer now, but there was a clear edge to it. "Not like you used to," Femi sighed. "I'm sorry. It's just been a lot." He glanced over at her. "I'm here now, right? That's what matters." "But are you really?" Ada's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of hurt and longing. "I've been asking for this trip for months, and it felt like you were just avoiding it." "I wasn't avoiding it," Femi said quickly. I had to make sure things at work were in order. You know how it is." "I know how it is, but that doesn't change how I feel," Ada replied. "I feel like you're here, but not really here with us." Femi didn't have a response. He couldn't tell her about his fears, about how every time he looked at Amara, he felt like he might fail her. What if she was the only child they'd ever have? What if he wasn't good enough as a father? Those thoughts kept him up at night, but he didn't know how to talk about them. Ada turned back to the window, her thoughts spinning. She had tried so hard to keep her family together, to keep them close, but it felt like everything was slipping away. And now, on the way to a vacation that was supposed to fix things, all she felt was the widening gap between them. "Femi, are you—" "Ada, please," he interrupted. "Can we not do this right now? Let's just get to the terminal and enjoy the trip, okay?" Ada sighed, the hurt lingering in her chest. "Okay, back home." Amara lay on the ground, her leg throbbing from the bite. She tried to push herself up, but the pain was too much. The bite was deep, and her small leg shook as she struggled to stand. Her heart raced with fear as tears blurred her vision. She glanced toward Mr. Obinna, her only hope for help. He remained still, his face expressionless, the shadow of his figure looming in the dark. His arms were crossed, as though he had no intention of moving. "Please," Amara whispered through trembling lips. "Help me." But Mr. Obinna only stared at her for a moment longer before turning and walking back into his house, his door closing with a faint click. Amara sobbed quietly, wrapping her arms around her legs as she tried to pull herself toward the door. The world felt so empty now. It was quiet, too quiet, except for the dull hum of the night and the fading growls of the dog somewhere in the distance. The blood from her wound soaked into her dress, sticky and warm. She pulled herself back into the house, dragging her leg across the floor, each movement sending sharp stabs of pain up her body. Every corner of the house felt colder, and the absence of her parents loomed over her like a heavy cloud. They were always there. Where were they now? Why had they left her? Amara reached the couch and pulled herself up, trying to control her shaky breathing. She wanted to cry for her mother, for her father, for anyone, but she was too weak. She curled up, her head resting on the edge of the couch, and let the exhaustion pull her under. Her leg hurt, but her heart hurt more. On the bus, Ada stared blankly at her phone. She had been thinking of checking in with the housemaid, but then she remembered. Nkechi had taken a few days off, leaving the house unattended. She bit her lip, a strange sense of unease creeping up on her. "Maybe we should call home," she said to Femi, her voice unsure. "Call home." Femi glanced at her, frowning slightly. "Amara's fine. We've only been gone a few hours." "I know, but—" Ada hesitated. She didn't want to seem paranoid, but something in her gut told her something wasn't right. Femi sighed. "She's fine, Ada. Let's just focus on getting to our destination. We've been waiting for this for so long. Let's enjoy it." Ada nodded, though the unease lingered. She tried to push the thought away, but it stayed with her, gnawing at her mind as the bus rumbled on. The house was silent now. Amara's breathing had slowed, but her leg throbbed with every beat of her heart. The dog was gone, and the night stretched on. She closed her eyes, hoping that when she woke up, her parents would be there. They always came back, didn't they? But as the hours passed and the house remained dark and empty, Amara knew deep down that this time, they weren't coming. Femi and Ada arrived at the small lodge just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the modest building. The receptionist, Mrs. Igioma, greeted them warmly, though her eyes flickered with curiosity as she took in their stiff posture and quiet demeanor. There was something off about the couple, something that told her this vacation wasn't just about relaxation. "Welcome, welcome," Mrs. Igioma chirped, bustling behind the counter as they checked in. "It's so good to see couples taking time away from the busyness of life. Lord knows we all need a break from the grind of work, children, and the rest." Ada gave a thin smile, her mind already drifting back to thoughts of Amara. "Yes," she said softly. "It's been a while." Femi stood beside her, hands in his pockets, staring off toward the dining area. Mrs. Igioma glanced between them, sensing the tension. "I'm sure your little one is safe and sound, hm?" Mrs. Igioma probed gently, her tone casual but her eyes sharp, watching for a reaction. "She's fine," Femi answered quickly, his voice clipped. We've left her in good hands. Ada tensed beside him, the lie hanging in the air between them like a thick cloud. She hadn't told Mrs. Igioma that no one was with Amara. She hadn't mentioned that they'd forgotten to arrange for care in their rush to escape. The guilt gnawed at her, but she said nothing, just nodding along with Femi's words. "Ah, good," Mrs. Igioma replied, though her eyes lingered on Ada a moment longer, sensing the woman's unease. "Well, dinner is served in an hour. It'll be a simple meal, but hearty enough. You two should enjoy yourselves. Life is too short for anything else, isn't it?" Femi grunted in agreement, and they made their way to their room. Back at home, the air was heavy with the weight of the night, and Amara struggled to keep her eyes open. Her leg throbbed painfully where the dog had bitten her, the blood now drying and caking around the wound. She couldn't stay here. She knew that now. No one was coming, and the house, once a place of warmth, now felt like a cold and distant tomb. With a deep breath, she pushed herself off the couch, wincing as pain shot through her leg. She bit her lip hard to keep from crying out. The living room seemed so much larger now, each corner shadowed, every sound amplified in the silence. She limped to the door, every step more agonizing than the last, but she had to find help. When she finally reached the front door and stepped outside, the night air hit her, cool against her tear-streaked face. She looked toward Mr. Obina's house, its windows dark and uninviting. He had watched her suffer earlier and done nothing. She didn't trust him. She couldn't. With the gate slightly ajar, Amara decided to take her chances and limp down the street. The road was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant bark of a dog. Her leg was shaking beneath her, and she felt dizzy, but she pressed on, determined to find help. It wasn't long before she reached the house of Mama Nena, the elderly woman known for her sharp tongue and stern nature. Amara hesitated at the gate, unsure if Mama Nena would even help her. The old woman wasn't exactly known for her kindness, but as the pain in her leg flared up again, Amara knew she had no other choice. She knocked weakly on the door, and within moments, the door swung open, revealing Mama Nena, her face lined with age and suspicion. "Amara?" Mama Nena's eyes widened as she saw the blood running down Amara's leg. "What in God's name happened to you?" Amara's voice was barely a whisper. "The dog. It bit me. I've been trying to find my mom and dad, but they're not home." Mama Nena let out a sharp breath, her expression hardening with anger, though not at Amara. "Come inside, quickly," she ordered, pulling Amara into the house and seating her in a chair. "Your parents left you alone? What kind of foolishness is this?" Amara flinched at the tone, but she was too tired to answer. Mama Nena bustled around, grabbing a cloth to clean the wound, muttering to herself the whole time. "I always said your parents were too busy for their own good." Mama Nena grumbled as she dabbed at Amara's leg, running around like the world revolves around them, leaving their child like this. God forbid. Amara winced as Mama Nena cleaned the bite, the cloth stinging as it touched her skin. "They didn't mean to," she whispered, feeling the need to defend them, even though she wasn't sure if it was true. "They just forgot." Mama Nena clicked her tongue. Forgot? Forgot their own daughter. She shook her head. Nonsense. This is what happens when people stop paying attention to what matters. Meanwhile, Mr. Obina stood at his window, watching as Mama Nena brought Amara inside. He'd been watching since she left the house, his expression cold and unreadable. His wife, Nkechi, came up behind him, her arms crossed as she looked at him with disapproval. "You're just going to stand there and do nothing?" Nkechi asked, her voice low but sharp. "She's a child, Obina." Obina didn't turn to face her. "She's their child," he muttered, his jaw clenched. "The one they flaunt, like they're better than us." Nkechi let out a frustrated sigh. "You're still bitter about that? You think watching her suffer is going to make things better for us?" Obina finally turned to her, his eyes hard. "You don't understand. They think their life is perfect because they have her. They look at us like we're less because we don't have children." Nkechi stared at him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. I understand more than you think, Obinna. But that's not her fault. Obinna's face tightened, but he said nothing more. He looked back out the window, watching as Mama Nena tended to Amara. His guilt gnawed at him, but he couldn't bring himself to move. At the lodge, Femi and Ada sat across from each other at a small table in the dining area, the silence between them thick and uncomfortable. Ada barely touched her food, her mind racing with thoughts of Amara. Something was wrong. She could feel it. I think we should call home, Ada said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Femi didn't even look up from his plate. Ada, we've been over this. Amara is fine. We left her with someone reliable. But what if she's not? Ada insisted, her voice rising slightly. What if something happened? Femi sighed heavily, setting down his fork. You're worrying for nothing. Can't we just focus on us for once? This trip was supposed to be about us. Remember? Ada stared at him, her frustration boiling over. How can I focus on us when I can't stop thinking about her? She's our child, Femi. How can you sit there and pretend like everything's fine? Because it is fine. Femi snapped, finally looking at her. You're overreacting. We needed this trip to get away from all the stress, to reconnect. Reconnecting? Ada's voice was sharp now. We haven't been connected in months. You've been avoiding me, avoiding Amara. This trip isn't going to fix that. Femi clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists under the table. That's not fair, Ada. I'm trying. But you keep making it about something else. Maybe because it is about something else, Ada shot back. I can't sit here and act like we're fine when we're not. And now I have this feeling. Something's wrong. I know it. Before Femi could respond, a voice interrupted them. You know, women's intuition is rarely wrong, a man's voice said from the table beside them. Both Femi and Ada turned to see Mr. Kalu, a businessman in his late 40s, watching them with a smirk. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed as if he were enjoying the show. Excuse me? Femi said, his tone icy. Mr. Kalu shrugged, unbothered by Femi's tone. I'm just saying if your wife says something's wrong, you might want to listen. I've learned the hard way not to ignore my own wife's instincts. Ada gave Femi a pointed look, but Femi's frustration only deepened. This is none of your business. Maybe not, Mr. Kalu replied with a lazy smile. But from where I'm sitting, it seems like you. Mr. Kalu continued, his voice casual but cutting. It seems like you're ignoring what's right in front of you. I've seen this play out before. Listen to her before it's too late. Ada remained quiet, her eyes locked on Femi, waiting for his reaction. Femi, tense and on edge, stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with more force than intended. Mind your own business, Femi growled, his voice low and dangerous. He turned back to Ada, his frustration spilling over. You've been doubting me for months, Ada. You think I don't care? That I don't want to be a father? That I don't love you? Ada rose from her seat, her patience snapping. It's not about love, Femi. It's about being present. It's about putting your family first. Right now, I don't know where my daughter is, and you're standing here like it doesn't even matter. How can I sit here and pretend like everything's fine? Femi's face hardened, the weight of her words hitting him, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. You're being paranoid, he said through gritted teeth. She's fine. She's safe. Ada shook her head, tears filling her eyes. I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend that I don't feel it. Something is wrong, and I can't ignore it. Without another word, Ada stormed out of the dining area, leaving Femi standing there, seething. Mr. Kalu watched the scene unfold with mild interest, his smirk fading as the tension between the couple grew palpable. Back in the small neighborhood, Mama Nena finished cleaning Amara's wound, but the old woman's concern deepened as she examined the bite. The wound had turned an angry red, and Amara's skin felt hot to the touch. The girl was feverish, her face pale from exhaustion and pain. We need to get you to a clinic, Mama Nena muttered, her brow furrowed. This bite's not healing right. You'll need proper treatment. Amara, barely able to keep her eyes open, nodded weakly. But My mom and dad, she whispered, her voice faint. They'll come back soon. I just need to wait for them. Mama Nena's lips pressed into a thin line, her disapproval obvious. Your parents shouldn't have left you like this. You're in no condition to wait, my dear. We're going to the clinic now, and if I have to drag your parents back here myself, I will. Just as she was about to help Amara stand, a knock came at the door, startling them both. Mama Nena's eyes narrowed as she walked over to open it, and standing there, with a conflicted look on his face, was Mr. Obinna. Mama Nena's expression darkened. What do you want, Obinna? Coming to gloat about the mess these parents have made? Mr. Obinna's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward Amara, who was slumped in the chair, looking weaker by the minute. His voice was stiff, but there was an edge of guilt in it. She's not going to make it through the night if you don't get her proper help, he said, his tone sharp but heavy. The clinic's far, and you can't take her there alone. Mama Nena crossed her arms, unimpressed by his sudden concern. And you think I'm going to trust you to help after you stood by and did nothing? Mr. Obinna looked away, his shoulders stiff. I'm not proud of that, but there's no time for this now. Let's get her to the clinic. I'll drive. Mama Nena hesitated, her eyes flicking between Amara and Mr. Obinna. The girl's breathing was becoming more labored, and her skin was starting to look clammy. Time was running out. With a huff, Mama Nena relented. Fine, she said, her voice terse. But don't think this makes up for anything, Obinna. Together, they helped Amara into Mr. Obinna's car, her small frame sagging between them as her strength gave out. Mr. Obinna drove quickly, the usually quiet night filled with the hum of the car engine as they sped toward the clinic. As they drove, Amara's head lolled to the side, her voice barely audible. Mama Nena, will my parents be mad at me? Mama Nena, her heart softening despite her anger toward Femi and Ada, reached over and gently brushed Amara's hair from her face. No, my dear, they'll be mad at themselves for leaving you like this, but you'll be fine soon. Just hold on. Meanwhile, Ada was hurriedly packing her things back at the lodge, her hands trembling with urgency. Every part of her screamed that she needed to get back to Amara. Femi walked into the room, his face a mixture of frustration and worry. Are you seriously doing this? He asked, his voice low and tense. You're going to leave because of some feeling? Ada didn't stop packing. It's not just a feeling, Femi. It's instinct. I know something is wrong, and I can't sit here and do nothing while my daughter could be in danger. Femi ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. Ada, you're overreacting. We've only been gone a few hours. I'm not overreacting, Ada snapped, turning to face him. Why can't you see that this trip was never just about getting away? It was about us, yes, but it was about being a family, about reconnecting with what matters. And right now, the most important thing is Amara. Femi stopped pacing, his expression softening as Ada's words hit him. He stood there, staring at her, the tension between them thick but now tinged with something else, fear. Fear that she was right. Fear that he had been wrong to ignore her. Ada grabbed her bag, her voice softer now but firm. I'm going back, Femi. With or without you. Femi's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, his own doubts crept in. He had dismissed Ada's concerns because he didn't want to face the possibility that they had made a terrible mistake. Now, as he watched her walk toward the door, a knot of fear tightened in his chest. Wait, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ada paused, her hand on the doorknob. Femi swallowed hard. I'll come with you. At the clinic, Mama Nena and Mr. Obinna waited anxiously as the doctor examined Amara. She had been immediately taken in upon arrival, her condition more serious than they had realized. Mr. Obinna paced the waiting room, his guilt now a physical weight on his shoulders. Mama Nena sat, her arms crossed, watching him with narrowed eyes. You think this will ease your conscience? She asked, her voice cutting. Mr. Obinna stopped pacing and looked at her, his face strained. I don't know, he admitted. I let my pride get in the way. I watched her suffer because I was angry, and now I can't take it back. Mama Nena shook her head. No, you can't. But at least you did something now, before it was too late. Mr. Obinna nodded, but the guilt remained. As the minutes ticked by, they both sat in tense silence, waiting for news, knowing that the consequences of the night would ripple far beyond this moment. The silence in the car was heavy, suffocating. Ada sat rigid in her seat, her fingers gripping her phone tightly. Femi focused on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The tension between them hung in the air, but neither of them spoke. The argument that had erupted at the lodge had left them both raw, but it was overshadowed by something bigger now, the fear gnawing at both of them. Ada broke the silence first. I knew it, Femi. I knew something was wrong. We should have called sooner. We shouldn't have left her. Femi didn't respond at first. He stared straight ahead, the road blurring in his vision. He wanted to say something, anything, but his throat was tight with guilt. Ada's voice was rising with every word, and he knew she was right, but admitting that felt too heavy to bear. You should have listened to me, Ada continued, her voice cracking. All of this could have been avoided. What if? Her phone rang, cutting her off. The sound startled both of them, and Ada fumbled to answer it, her heart racing. It was Mama Nena. Ada, it's me, came the older woman's sharp voice. You need to get back home now. Amara's at the clinic. Ada froze, her mind going blank for a moment before the words sank in. What? Why? What happened? That cursed dog of Obinna's bit her, Mama Nena said, her tone filled with equal parts judgment and concern. She's been at the clinic for a while now. If I hadn't found her, who knows what would have happened. You should be ashamed of yourselves, Ada. The guilt hit Ada like a physical blow. Her hand trembled as she held the phone to her ear. Is she? How bad is it? Is she okay? She's alive, but she's hurt. The infection was spreading. The doctors are doing what they can. But you need to get here now. This girl's been through enough. What were you thinking, leaving her like that? Ada choked back a sob, her hand covering her mouth. We didn't mean to, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Didn't mean to or not, it's done. Just get here. She needs you. The line went dead, and Ada sat there in stunned silence, her phone still pressed to her ear. Femi glanced over at her, a sinking feeling in his stomach. Ada. What happened? Amara's in the clinic, Ada whispered, her voice hollow. She's been bitten. By Obinna's dog. Femi's heart dropped. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his mind racing. Is she okay? He asked, though he already knew the answer. They don't know, Ada said, her voice cracking. The infection was spreading. She could have died, Femi. She could have died because we weren't there. Femi's breath hitched, the weight of his guilt crashing down on him. I didn't think, he began, but the words felt empty, meaningless. He had been so sure Amara would be fine, that Ada was just overreacting. Now, the reality of what had happened was too much to bear. Neither of them said another word as Femi pressed harder on the gas, the car speeding down the road toward the clinic. At the clinic, Amara lay in a small, sterile room, her leg bandaged and elevated. She was exhausted, her small body drained from the pain and the fever that had gripped her hours earlier. Nurse Beezy sat beside her, gently dabbing her forehead with a cool cloth, offering quiet words of comfort. You're a strong girl, Amara, Nurse Beezy said softly. You're going to get better soon. I promise. Amara's eyes fluttered open. She was still weak, her voice barely above a whisper. Where's my mommy? Where's my daddy? Nurse Beezy exchanged a look with Dr. Okachukwu, who stood at the foot of the bed, reviewing her chart. The doctor was stern but kind, his eyes full of concern for the small girl. They're on their way, Nurse Beezy said, brushing a strand of hair from Amara's face. They'll be here soon. Just rest now. Amara nodded weakly, her eyelids heavy. I'm so tired, she murmured. I know, sweetheart. Just rest. Dr. Okachukwu glanced at the clock, his face tightening. If Mama Nena hadn't brought her in when she did, the infection would have been worse, he said quietly to Nurse Beezy. The wound was already starting to fester. She's lucky. Her parents are lucky, Nurse Beezy replied, her voice harder now. Leaving her like that? Dr. Okachukwu nodded, his eyes softening as he looked at Amara. People forget how fragile children are. Physically, she'll recover, but emotionally, this is going to leave a mark. Mama Nena, who had been standing just outside the door, stepped into the room, her face set in a deep frown. Any news from the parents? Not yet, Dr. Okachukwu said, but they should be here soon. I've made sure Amara is stable for now, but she'll need more care and rest. Mama Nena's lips thinned. More care than they've been giving her. That's for sure. She walked over to Amara, her heart softening as she looked at the girl's pale face. Despite her tough exterior, Mama Nena cared deeply for the child. She reached out and gently touched Amara's hand. Don't worry, child. You'll be all right now. Back outside the clinic, Mr. Obinna sat in his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He stared straight ahead, his thoughts a chaotic mix of guilt, resentment, and shame. He hadn't been able to get the image of Amara, bleeding, weak, helpless, out of his head. He knew he should have helped her sooner, should have done something, but he had let his bitterness cloud his judgment. You can't sit here all night, came Kechi's voice from the passenger seat. She looked at him, her expression a mix of frustration and concern. You've already done more by bringing her to the clinic. At least go inside and see how she's doing. Obinna didn't move. I don't think I deserve to. Kechi sighed, her patience wearing thin. Obinna, you did the right thing in the end. We can't change what happened, but you can't just sit here, avoiding it. Go inside. Face it. Obinna's jaw tightened, his hands clenching around the steering wheel. He wasn't ready to face Femi, wasn't ready to confront his own guilt. But he also knew Kechi was right. Sitting in the car wouldn't change anything. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out. Femi and Ada rushed into the clinic, their eyes wide with panic. Ada's heart pounded in her chest, her mind spinning with 100 worst-case scenarios. They hurried to the reception desk, breathless. We're here for our daughter, Ada said, her voice cracking. Amara. She was brought in earlier. The receptionist nodded, recognizing the desperation in her eyes. She's in room 3, but you'll need to speak to the doctor first. They barely heard the receptionist's last words as they bolted toward the room. They skidded to a stop outside the door, where Mama Nena stood, her arms crossed and her expression severe. You finally made it, Mama Nena said, her tone sharp. Took you long enough. Ada flinched at the words, the weight of her guilt suffocating her. I'm so sorry. We didn't mean to. Mama Nena cut her off with a scowl. Sorry doesn't change the fact that you left her alone. You were too wrapped up in your own problems to see what was happening right under your noses. If it weren't for me, that child would be lying in that house, suffering in silence. Femi stood silently beside Ada, his head bowed. He couldn't even meet Mama Nena's eyes. He knew she was right, and the shame of it gnawed at him. Where is she? Ada whispered, tears filling her eyes. She's resting, Mama Nena said, her tone softening slightly. She's stable now, thanks to the doctors. But this could have ended much worse. Ada pushed past her, entering the room. The sight of Amara lying on the hospital bed, pale and fragile, was too much for her to bear. Tears streamed down her face as she rushed to her daughter's side. Amara, Ada sobbed, grabbing her hand. I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. Amara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at her mother, her small voice filled with confusion and pain. You left me, Mama, she whispered. Ada's heart shattered. She kissed Amara's hand, her body shaking with sobs. I know, baby. I know. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I'll never leave you again. I promise. Femi stood at the foot of the bed, his guilt too heavy to put into words. He couldn't bring himself to look at Amara, his shame pulling him further away. Everything had fallen apart, and it was all his fault. Later, as Amara slept, Femi and Ada sat in the waiting area outside her room. The tension between them was thick, but it was no longer filled with anger. Now it was heavy with guilt and sadness. Femi stared at the floor, his hands clasped in front of him. I never wanted this, he whispered. I thought I was doing the right thing, focusing on work, trying to be the provider. Ada didn't say anything at first. She was emotionally drained, her body aching from the weight of the day. We've both made mistakes, she said quietly. But we have to fix this, Femi. We can't keep going like this. Amara needs us. She needs both of us. Femi looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. I know, he said softly, but I don't know how to make this right. We start by being there, Ada said, her voice firmer now. We start by putting her first. Always. As they spoke, Mr. Obinna walked toward them, his steps hesitant. He stopped just short of the waiting area, his hands shoved into his pockets, his eyes filled with guilt. He took a deep breath and approached them, clearing his throat. Femi and Ada looked up, surprised to see him. I wanted to say, I'm sorry, Obinna said, his voice gruff but sincere. I should have helped sooner. I let my own bitterness get in the way, and that child suffered for it. Femi stood, his expression conflicted. He didn't know what to say. Obinna's apology caught him off guard. For a moment, they just stared at each other, both weighed down by their own mistakes. I don't know what to say, Femi finally muttered. Obinna shook his head. You don't have to say anything. Just take care of your family. Don't make the same mistakes I made. Inside the clinic, Femi and Ada sat in tense silence, the weight of their recent argument still pressing heavily on them. They hadn't spoken for several minutes, both consumed by their guilt, when Mr. Obinna appeared at the door. His expression was stiff, and for a moment, he hesitated, as though unsure of whether he should be there. I wanted to apologize, he said, his voice low and rough. Femi and Ada looked up in surprise. Mr. Obinna shifted uncomfortably on his feet. I should have helped sooner. I let my anger get in the way. Femi stood, his shoulders tense. Why didn't you help? Why stand there and watch? Obinna met his gaze, struggling with his own shame. Because every time I saw Amara, it reminded me of what I couldn't have. I was bitter, and I let that blind me. He looked away, clearly pained. But this isn't about me. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, before Femi could respond. The clinic door swung open and Chinyu stormed in, her expression tight with urgency. Ada, Femi, have you seen the news? Both of them frowned. What news? Ada asked, her voice wary. Chinyu thrust her phone toward them, her eyes wide. It's all over the community. Someone posted about what happened to Amara. The story's spreading like wildfire. And it's not just gossip anymore. Femi took the phone from Chinyu's hand, his heart sinking as he read the headline on the local blog. Child neglect. Shocking details emerge about Amara's abandonment. His breath caught in his throat as he scrolled through the post. The details of their private disaster now exposed for the entire community to see. Comments were already piling up, judgment and condemnation swirling around their family. Ada's face went pale as she read over his shoulder. How did this happen? Who would? Chinyu sighed. People love to talk. Someone must have leaked the story to the local blog. It's only a matter of time before it spreads further. Femi gritted his teeth, his frustration and helplessness boiling over. This is going to destroy us. Ada's hands trembled as she sank into the chair, her worst fears materializing in front of her. How are we supposed to fix this now? Obinna, who had been quietly watching, cleared his throat. This might be my fault, he admitted, his voice tight with guilt. I didn't tell anyone directly, but people talk, and maybe my bitterness made things worse. Femi stared at him, his anger flickering back. So it wasn't enough to stand by and let my daughter suffer. Now you've helped spread this. Before things could escalate, Nurse Beezy appeared, interrupting the tense moment. Mr. and Mrs. Femi, I need to speak with you about Amara's condition. Ada immediately stood, her focus shifting back to her daughter. Is she all right? She's stable, but emotionally. She's still distant, Nurse Beezy explained. She's asking for Mama Nena again. I think it's best if we consider psychological support. Amara's trust has been shaken, and forcing her home too quickly might worsen the situation. Ada's heart clenched. She's our daughter. We should be the ones taking care of her. I understand, Nurse Beezy said gently. But you need to give her time. She needs to feel safe again. Mama Nena has been her anchor through this, and we can't disrupt that. You'll have to rebuild her trust, step by step. The words hung in the air as Ada and Femi exchanged glances. It was clear now that fixing their relationship with Amara wasn't going to be as simple as taking her home and making promises. They had a long road ahead. As Femi opened his mouth to respond, Chinyu's phone buzzed again. Another notification, another headline. Chinyu looked at the phone, her face hardening. The story's getting worse. People are starting to speculate about the state of your marriage. They're saying this isn't just about Amara, that there's more going on with your family. Femi's eyes darkened as the weight of the public scrutiny hit him. Ada's hands trembled as she processed the fact that their private pain was now becoming public spectacle. I think you need to get ahead of this, Chinyu warned. If this spirals, it won't just be about Amara. It'll be about you and Femi. About your entire family. The room was thick with tension, the realization of what lay ahead sinking in. The following day, Amara would be discharged from the hospital with heavy medications. The journey home from the clinic was quiet, the car filled with unspoken tension. Femi gripped the steering wheel, his eyes focused on the road, while Ada sat beside him, her thoughts racing. In the back seat, Amara leaned against the window, staring out in silence. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on them, thick and suffocating. They arrived home, the house feeling different now, heavier, colder. The familiar comfort they once felt walking through the front door had been replaced by a sense of unease, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension. Femi and Ada helped Amara inside, though she didn't say much. She limped slightly as she made her way to the couch, still recovering from the dog bite. But it was her emotional wounds that worried Ada more. Amara barely looked at either of them, and the distance between them felt like a chasm that no amount of words could bridge. Femi set his keys down on the counter and let out a heavy sigh. "We're home," he muttered, though the words felt hollow. Ada glanced at Amara, then at Femi. "I'll make her something to eat," she said quietly, disappearing into the kitchen as Femi sat down, his thoughts heavy with guilt and exhaustion. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a soft glow on the living room. But inside the house, the atmosphere remained heavy. Femi stood by the kitchen counter, his phone in hand, staring at the screen in frustration. The blog post had spread across the community like wildfire, and the comments were relentless, full of judgment and criticism, some from people he barely knew, others from people he had once considered friends. Ada walked into the room, her face lined with exhaustion. She glanced at Femi, her heart sinking as she saw the familiar look of strain on his face. "You're still reading that?" she asked, her voice tight. Femi set the phone down, rubbing his temples. He didn't answer right away, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. "We need to address this," Ada continued, sitting down at the kitchen table. "We can't just let it spread. People think we left her on purpose. Like we didn't care." Femi sighed heavily, leaning against the counter. "And what do you think will happen if we talk? The more we say, the worse it'll get. Let them talk. It'll die down eventually." Ada's patience snapped. "Die down? Femi, people are saying we abandoned our daughter, and you want to just stay quiet? How can you be so calm about this?" Femi's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I'm not calm, Ada. I'm just not interested in making things worse. The more attention we draw, the more judgment we invite." Ada stood, her hands shaking. "We've already been judged. Every time I go out, I see people staring at me, whispering. Do you think I don't feel that? Do you think it's easy for me?" She walked toward him, her voice trembling with emotion. "I can't keep pretending that everything's fine, because it's not fine. We made a mistake, but the way people are talking, it's like we're monsters." Femi turned away, unable to meet her eyes. "I just don't see how talking will fix anything." Ada let out a bitter laugh. "Ignoring it won't fix it either, Femi. I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of drowning in this mess while you stand there and act like everything will blow over The silence between them grew thick, the air heavy with unspoken hurt. Femi didn't respond, and Ada, her heart aching, turned away from him and left the room. Later that morning, Mama Nena arrived at the house. She had become a regular visitor, checking on Amara frequently since the incident. Amara had grown closer to her, seeking comfort in her presence in a way that she hadn't been able to with her own parents. Ada sat in the living room with Amara, watching as her daughter spoke softly with Mama Nena. The distance between Ada and Amara felt unbearable. She had tried to talk to her daughter, to rebuild the bond they once shared, but Amara remained distant. Every attempt Ada made to connect was met with hesitation or outright rejection. "How are you feeling today, Amara?" Mama Nena asked, her voice soft as she sat beside the little girl. Amara shrugged, her eyes cast down. "My leg doesn't hurt as much." "That's good," Mama Nena said, nodding. "And how about in here?" she asked, gently touching Amara's chest. "How does your heart feel?" Amara's face tightened, and she avoided Mama Nena's gaze. "I don't know." Ada, sitting across from them, leaned forward. "Amara, maybe we could spend some time together today? Just the two of us like we used to." Amara hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "Can Mama Nena come too?" Ada's heart sank, but she forced a smile. "Of course, if that's what you want." Amara nodded slowly, glancing at Mama Nena for reassurance. "Okay, but only if she's there." Ada blinked away the sting of tears and managed to nod. "We'll do it together then." The pain of her daughter's rejection cut deep. Ada understood that Amara was still healing, but it didn't make the distance between them any easier to bear. She felt like she was losing her daughter, and no matter what she did, she couldn't seem to reach her. That afternoon, Femi went out to buy groceries, trying to escape the suffocating tension at home. But as soon as he entered the store, he felt the eyes on him. People stared, whispered, and pointed. Their judgment was palpable, like a physical weight pressing down on him. "That's him," a woman whispered to her friend in the next aisle. "The one who left his daughter alone." Another voice responded, quieter but no less accusatory. "It's terrible. How could they just abandon her like that?" Femi gritted his teeth, gripping the handle of the cart tightly as he moved through the aisles. It felt like he was walking through a gauntlet of silent accusations. The whispers followed him wherever he went, each word cutting deeper than the last. As he approached the checkout, a voice behind him stopped him in his tracks. Femi. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Mr. Obinna stood a few feet away, his expression uneasy. Femi's stomach twisted with a mix of anger and resentment. "What do you want, Obinna?" Femi asked, his voice cold. Obinna hesitated before stepping closer. "We need to talk." Femi turned slowly to face him, his eyes hard. "Talk? What could you possibly have to say now?" Obinna shifted uncomfortably, his guilt evident. "I already apologized at the clinic, but I didn't say everything I needed to. I know things have gotten worse with the rumors, and part of that is on me." Femi's fists clenched at his sides, his anger flaring. "Part of it? You didn't just stand by when Amara needed help. You stood by and let the whole neighborhood turn against us. People are judging us because you let them think the worst of us." Obinna flinched, but he didn't back down. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad, Femi. I didn't spread the rumors, but I didn't stop them either. And for that, I'm sorry." Femi's jaw tightened, his voice low with restrained fury. "Do you think sorry fixes this? People think we abandoned our daughter because of you. Do you know how that feels?" Obinna looked down, his face etched with regret. "I know it doesn't fix anything. I let my bitterness take over, and I should have stopped it before it got this far. But I didn't." Femi stared at him, his chest tight with anger and frustration. "You let your bitterness get in the way, and now my family is paying the price." Obinna nodded, his voice soft. "I never wanted this to happen, Femi. I never wanted it to go this far." Femi's eyes burned with unshed tears, but he blinked them away. "It's too late for that." Without waiting for a response, Femi turned and walked out of the store, leaving Obinna standing alone in the aisle. Back at home, Ada sat at the kitchen table, watching as Amara and Mama Nena prepared to bake cookies. It had once been a tradition between Ada and Amara, something they did together on quiet weekends. But now, even this small tradition had been overshadowed by the distance between them. Amara focused on rolling the dough, her small hands moving carefully as she worked. Ada watched her, feeling like she was looking at a stranger. The closeness they once had felt like a distant memory, something fragile that had shattered beyond repair. "Do you remember how we used to bake cookies every Sunday?" Ada asked gently, trying to break through the wall between them. Amara nodded but didn't look up. "Yeah." But Mama Nena wasn't there then. Ada's heart clenched, but she forced herself to smile. "That's right. But maybe we can start a new tradition, all of us together." Amara shrugged, still not fully engaging. Ada's chest tightened, knowing that while she had made progress, the road to fully reconnecting with her daughter was long. As the cookies baked in the oven, the smell filled the house with the familiar warmth of times past. But as Ada sat at the table, watching Amara laugh with Mama Nena, she realized just how far they still had to go. Later that evening, Femi returned from the store, his face tight with frustration. Ada looked up as he walked into the kitchen, sensing the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Rough day?" she asked softly, trying to break the ice. Femi let out a bitter laugh. "You could say that." Ada stood and walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm. For a moment, they stood in silence, both feeling the weight of their shared burden. They were trying, both of them, but it was hard to see a way forward when everything felt so broken. "We'll get through this," Ada whispered, though even she wasn't sure if she believed it. Femi exhaled, his eyes tired and worn. "I hope so." The days after their return home from the clinic passed in a blur. Ada spent most of her time hovering near Amara, hoping to find an opportunity to rebuild their connection. But every time she tried, Amara pulled further away. The little girl spent more time with Mama Nena than with her own parents, and every small rejection stung Ada deeply. In the evenings, Ada and Femi barely spoke to each other, the strain of everything hanging between them like a thick fog. Femi's frustration with the community's judgment weighed heavily on him, but his inability to reach Amara gnawed at him even more. On a particularly quiet morning, Ada approached Amara in the living room where she sat playing with her toys. "Amara, sweetheart," she began cautiously, "would you like to spend some time together today? Just us? We could go to the park or maybe bake something special." Amara didn't look up from her toys. She hesitated before replying, her voice small. "Can Mama Nena come too?" The words pierced through Ada, but she forced a smile. "Of course," she said, sitting beside her daughter, her heart aching with the knowledge that she was no longer Amara's first choice. The gossip from the blog post continued to ripple through their lives. At the local grocery store, at church, and even in passing conversations with neighbors, the whispers and judgmental stares followed them like shadows. Later that week, a notice arrived in the mail. A community meeting was scheduled for the weekend, and the agenda included addressing concerns regarding child welfare. The vague wording made it clear that the post about Amara was a topic of interest, and Chinyu had wasted no time ensuring the community would confront Femi and Ada directly. Ada read the notice aloud to Femi, her voice shaking. "We're going to have to face them," she whispered, setting the paper down on the kitchen table. Femi leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched. "And what are we supposed to say? Do we defend ourselves? Or do we just take the blame for everything?" Ada sighed, burying her face in her hands. "We didn't do it on purpose. People need to know that." Femi remained silent, his thoughts heavy. He had always hated public confrontations, but this was unavoidable. No matter how much they wanted to move forward, the community wasn't going to let them forget the mistake they had made. The night of the meeting arrived quickly. Femi and Ada sat in the front row of the local community hall, the low hum of conversation filling the air around them. They could feel the stares from every direction. Chinyu, seated a few rows back, caught Ada's eye and gave her a small, tight-lipped nod, more of a challenge than a greeting. The community leader, Mr. Ibe, stood at the front of the room, tapping his papers against the podium before calling the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight, we'll be discussing some important issues that have recently surfaced. Ada's heart pounded as she listened to him speak. She glanced at Femi, who sat rigid beside her, his eyes fixed on the floor. The first item on the agenda is a matter that has concerned many of us. The well-being of Amara, Femi, and Ada's daughter, and the circumstances that have been shared publicly about her care. All eyes turned to Femi and Ada, the weight of judgment palpable. Ada's stomach twisted in knots. She had known this was coming, but it didn't make it any easier to face. Chinyu was the first to speak, her voice cool and collected. Ada, Femi, we all care about Amara, and I think everyone here just wants to understand. Why was she left alone? Why didn't you arrange for someone to watch her? There are rumors, and you know how people talk. Ada took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. It was an accident, she began, her voice trembling. We didn't mean to leave her alone. We were rushing to catch a bus. And in the chaos of everything, we forgot to arrange for someone to stay with her. We made a terrible mistake, Femi added, his voice low. We know that now, and we've been trying to make it right ever since. Mr. IB nodded, but Chinyu pressed on. And what about the blog post? Why didn't you say anything sooner to clarify what happened? People have been left to assume the worst. Ada clenched her fists in her lap, struggling to contain her frustration. We didn't want to make things worse by feeding the gossip. Every time we try to explain, people twist our words. We just want to move forward and focus on Amara. A murmur rippled through the room. Some of the faces in the crowd softened, while others remained stony, their judgment still firm. The tension was thick as Mr. IBE stepped in to wrap up the discussion. I think it's clear that Femi and Ada made a mistake, but it's also clear that they love their daughter and are working hard to make things right. Perhaps we should give them the space they need to heal as a family. Chinyu didn't look convinced, but she stayed quiet, her eyes still fixed on Ada with quiet disapproval. The meeting ended shortly after, and as Femi and Ada left the hall, the weight on their shoulders felt lighter but far from lifted. Back home that evening, Ada sat at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. The meeting had drained her, but a part of her was relieved that it was over. Femi stood by the window, staring out into the dark street. I don't know if it'll ever get easier, he muttered. No matter what we say, people will always think the worst. Ada sighed, standing to join him by the window. Maybe, she said softly, but at least we faced it. We didn't hide. They stood in silence for a few moments, the weight of everything still hanging between them. I think I haven't really been here, Ada, Femi finally said, his voice breaking the quiet. Not just with Amara, but with you too. I thought if I worked hard, if I provided for us, that would be enough. But I've been distant, and I'm sorry for that. Ada looked up at him, her eyes softening. I was so afraid of losing you and Amara that I didn't even see what was happening to us. I thought if I just held everything together, it would fix itself. But I was wrong too. Femi reached out, gently taking her hand. I want to try, Ada. I want to be better for you. For Amara. Ada nodded, tears stinging her eyes. We'll try together. The next morning, Nurse Beezy came by to check on Amara and discuss her progress. Amara had started attending therapy sessions with a child psychologist, but the road to emotional healing was long. Though she was starting to open up in small ways, the distance between her and her parents was still there, a wound not yet fully healed. As Nurse Beezy spoke with Ada and Femi, Amara wandered into the living room, her eyes cautious but curious. Amara, sweetie, would you like to help me with something? Ada asked, smiling softly. I was thinking we could plant some flowers in the garden. Maybe make it a little brighter. Amara hesitated, looking between her parents and Nurse Beezy. Slowly, she nodded. Can Mama Nena help too? Ada's heart clenched, but she smiled. Of course, we can all do it together. They spent the afternoon in the garden, planting flowers in the warm soil. Amara stayed close to Mama Nena, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where she glanced at Ada with something like curiosity, as if she was trying to see if her mother could be trusted again. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and that was enough for Ada for now. Just when the house had settled into a tentative peace that evening, a knock came at the door. Femi opened it to find a small envelope lying on the front step, no name or return address. He picked it up, frowning as he tore it open. Inside was a single note. Your family's secrets aren't safe. Be careful who you trust. Femi's stomach dropped as he handed the note to Ada, who read it with wide eyes. What does this mean? Who sent this? She whispered, fear creeping into her voice. Femi shook his head, his heart pounding. I don't know, but it's not over yet. They stood together, staring at the note, knowing that while they had started to rebuild, the path ahead was far from clear. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss any new stories on this channel. Also, here is another interesting story that you will enjoy. Click to watch now.